So we are recording. Welcome to our Proficiency Award help session, question and answer session. I appreciate you guys being here. I hope that the start to your new year and second semester are going smoothly. I know it's been a really interesting school year. Probably more so for any of you than for us, but been a difficult time. I appreciate what you're doing. So in order to keep us moving, I want to say thank you. I want to introduce to you a group of people that I know that you know. I want to make sure you're aware of who's joining us on behalf of our state staff that we call the Proficiency Award Committee, because they're the group within each region and within our office that take the lead on proficiency. So we've got Mr. Brandon Ray joining us in the North Region office. We've got Mr. Kevin Jump from the Central Region, and Ms. Brittany Schwing in the South Region. Mr. Beecham, South Region Director, is also joining us. Mr. Hughes will be with us in a little bit. You're welcome to approach anybody on staff with a proficiency question. You're not isolated to this group of people, but know that in each region office, these are the folks that take the lead. And then in our office, with final plans for state applications, and when they move on to national judging, that's a process that I get to be part of as well. So want to make sure you get to know who that group is. So now that we've introduced each other, I want to go over just a couple of things at the very beginning for everybody, and then we're going to get into questions that were submitted on our Google form first, and then there should be time for live questions. I do want to let you know that I'm going to go ahead with a growing number of people. It's not that I don't want your feedback, but we're going to go ahead and mute everybody. And you can, we ask that you put questions in the chat. Now, if it's something you really want or need to share aloud, I don't mind that at all. If you can find a way to get my attention, put something in the chat or raise your hand on here, we'll get to you. But we're going to start by leaving everybody muted just based on the pure volume and making sure nobody gets left behind. We got some folks that are going to monitor the chat. So if you've got a specific question, know that you can put that in the chat room and we'll get to them there. But let's fire first up with the with this idea of categories. As important as getting the application filled out correctly, it's very important that a student chooses the correct category, or whatever work they do could end up being for naught if that application is disqualified. And we don't want that for any of you. We certainly don't want that for your region or for the state of Georgia if we move far enough along. So as part of the email that was sent out on Monday, there were several pieces of information in there, I know. One item on there was a tip for being in the right category. I hope that you will spend some time on that. I'm not going to read that document to you now, but I want to go over a few highlights and some common traps that teachers and students can step into without being aware. And just want to make sure that you're completely aware of what some of those are. Very, very important that you read Proficiency Award descriptions. Some SAEs are very clear. Beef cattle production is beef cattle production. Swine production is swine production. We get that. Equine is equine. Those are horses. But there are some really creative and innovative SAEs, and some of these categories exist for students to be able to show some really unique things that they do, which is great. Understand that proficiency awards are similar in nature as the state degree and the American degree. Where they are unique from those is that they focus on a specific piece or category. For example, if a student is going to go all the way from planting and growing their own vegetables, fruit and vegetables, all the way to the end of processing and canning and selling jelly, that's one SAE, and that's a great SAE. And all of that could go in one degree application, state or American degree. Is all of that going to fit in the same Proficiency Award application? The answer is no. There is a fruit production category. There is an ag processing category. And to do all of that, you'll need both categories. On the one side, you can say, well, that's really not fair because the student can't cover the whole story in one application. That's true. The other part that is fair, that is a benefit, is that that particular student has two opportunities for recognition. A student who raises beef cattle are beef cattle this year, next year, and the year after that. Unless they add something to it, that is beef production. The student in the example that I gave you can fill out fruit production one year and processing the next. And so understand that there are certain SAEs that cover a wide range, and they may cover a variety of categories. Some can be combined, some it's a little harder to do that. So I want to go through just a few points that I would share with you when you're selecting categories. With all categories, everybody hear this and understand it. With all categories, the A in SAE is agriculture. Now, agriculture is diverse, and it's getting more and more diverse all the time. I understand that. But if it's not agricultural in nature, the SAE is not going to be considered for a Proficiency Award state or American degree. Now, I know that all of you deal with unique situations and students with unique situations. And the long and short of it is what you choose to count as an SAE locally for a grade and for what you do, if you look at that and say, you know, that's the best that student is going to be able to do. If that's genuinely where they are and you decide to count that, that's up to you. But know that when it comes time to apply for award applications, state degree, American degree proficiencies, that does not mean because you've accepted it as an SAE that it's going to fit here. And the standards are what they are. And while we're diversifying, we're not lowering standards. And I know for some students, they don't grow up on farms and they don't have traditional backgrounds. And so they're not expected to all have production SAEs. But what a great opportunity to teach some level of the value that we are still agriculture. You're in agriculture education. So we expect your SAE to be some level of agriculture. So understand that everything that's not agriculture in nature really runs a risk of not being accepted in a proficiency category. I'm going to start with ag mechanics and be real general here, but ag mechanics, it's common if a student is using some skills that they may learn in an ag mechanics class, but if they are restoring or working on everyday automobiles, or they are building houses, doing electricity for residential areas, those are great jobs for high school students. And I believe you when you tell me that they're using some skills they learned in an ag mechanics or electricity class with you. I get that. What I'm asking you to understand is that the jobs they're doing and the skills they're using are in residential and general automotive. These categories are agricultural mechanics. So working on agricultural equipment, working with agricultural projects. So keep that in mind as you go through that ag mechanics category. We don't deal with it as much in Georgia, but on the national committee that reviews these state winners that come in, very common for a lot of agricultural mechanics areas to have those students move to participant level because they're doing residential house building, residential electricity, working on general automotive. Again, find jobs, not agricultural in nature according to these proficiencies. So be cautious of that. Agricultural processing, make sure you pay attention to that is food processing, not food preparation, and not food service. If your student works at a fast food restaurant or any type of restaurant, and yes, they're dealing with the safe handling of food, I get that. But if they're preparing and selling food, again, a fine job. Food service and food preparation is not food processing, and it's also not exclusively agricultural in nature. So keep that in mind. Agricultural sales, a common thought here, and I get why it would be a misconception if you don't read these guidelines specifically. If a student creates or processes, fabricates something of their own to then sell it, even though the primary objective is to sell it, that does not fit in ag sales. And some of you may be thinking, well, gee, I don't understand that. Why is that? I understand your concern, and maybe you could argue that it does. But for now, the guidelines say that it does not. Give you an example. A student is taking metal or wood or old deer antlers and pieces of metal, making and selling knives. You might think that's ag sales. The ag sales guidelines say that if they are fashioning that and putting it together themselves to then sell, it doesn't belong in ag sales. I had an application last year that was turned in that was a region winner. Student, as I mentioned earlier, it wasn't fruit all the way to jelly. It was a different product all the way to soap. They were generating the product and going all the way to making and selling their own soap. Neat SAE, pretty cool. Not ag sales because they're making a finished product from a raw product to sell. So understand with ag sales where that fits in. Ag services, make sure that it's agricultural in nature and doesn't fit in another category. Anything that's diversified, make sure that it's truly diversified. Diversified agriculture, at least one crop and at least one animal. Okay? That's not two different kinds of animals, because that's diversified livestock. And you don't get to do diversified livestock one year and then diversified ag the next year, because it's still two animals. That is, look at the categories listed, at least one crop and at least one animal. Diversified crop, two different proficiency categories. Okay, so if a student has got cotton and peanuts, or cotton and soybeans, that's diversified crop, right? The answer to that is no, and the reason is because those both belong in fiber and oil crop category. So yes, it's two different crops. For the categories, they're both fiber crops, so it fits in one. So in order to be diversified crop, I need two crops that fit in different categories. I need corn and cotton. I need hay that's grown for forage, which would be forage production, which we'll get to in a minute, or a grain. So different crops that fit in different categories. So just make sure you pay attention to little details like that in the diversified categories. Got to be two or more. Diversified horticulture, two different areas of horticulture. If it's all floral design, that's not diversified. That's floral design. Okay, so make sure that you adhere to the word diversified. Diversified livestock, that's pretty clear. Two different forms of livestock, and they're all listed in that application. You can sort that out. Forage and grain. There's a difference here. A grain can be a grain. It can also end up being a forage. If the sole purpose of that being produced and sold is to go be feed for animals, that's forage. So depending on what the student's end game with that product is, choose the right category. If you apply in grain, and all or some of your story and pictures and description and skills get into creating an animal feed stuff, that's not going to be accepted in grain, or at least the portions that are forage are not. They're going to be discounted and said, hey, that needs to be over in forage production. And likewise, if you enter forage and you think, well, that's great, you're growing a grain that could be a feed crop, you're not doing it as such. You're selling it as the grain. That's grain production. So make sure you pay attention to that as well. Landscape and turf, I won't go into all the specifics there, except that they're not interchangeable. They both can allow for some grass mowing. Landscaping has a lot more in it as far as other pieces of maybe cleaning up and beautifying yards and landscaping areas. Turf grass is really the production and management of grass itself. There can be mowing in that, but please don't think those are interchangeable, that I can apply in landscaping one year, turf the next, everything's exactly the same. It may work, but for some students, it may not. Those two are not interchangeable. They are somewhat different. Service learning was just added last year. It's new, still a little bit gray to some people. Make sure that it's agricultural in nature, that a student identifies a need in the community and has an approved plan with a committee of people that's engaged in that. Read that category description very carefully and make sure that you meet all of the expectations of that. That's a really cool opportunity, but it's one that could be easy to miss the target because there's a lot to it. Small animal and veterinary science. They sound real similar and they can be real similar. Small animal care and production is the care of the animal, daily care of the animal or production of the animal. Vet science is working in veterinary fields. I may work at a vet clinic, and my only task there is to walk the dogs, clean the kennels, and feed them. Those are important tasks. I don't mean to undermine those at all. Just because I work at a vet doesn't mean I will apply in vet science if that's not my job there. If I'm in charge of kenneling, walking, feeding, daily, regular care of animals, healthy or unhealthy, that's small animal. Okay, and just because I may give a dog a shot, that doesn't mean that it necessarily goes in vet science. If I'm not working with a vet, under the supervision of a vet, doing vet work, it's likely small animal production. So those two also are not interchangeable. Be careful with their wildlife management. Biggest thing we run into there, hunting and fishing are great hobbies. Hobbies are not SAEs. Students can get into whether they're guiding hunts or doing some level of harvesting of animals for other purposes. But just because a student likes to hunt and fish does not make that their SAE and does not fit in the wildlife management category. So those are just a few broad pieces I would mention off the top, but very, very important that you choose the right category. I don't think any of you set out to intentionally put somebody in the wrong place. Not paying attention, not being aware of the categories. The other place where it can happen, Ag teachers, I've told you guys several times before, are very resourceful. That's a compliment. It's meant as such. You're very resourceful people. You serve a lot of different students with a lot of different backgrounds and opportunities. If you think, man, I got a great one here, how do I make that one work? Let's stretch it a little bit. I get you trying to help your student. Just be real cautious that if you stretch it too much, you're really not helping that student. You're putting him in a situation where you may get a call from your region office or from me letting you know that that application is not going to fit in that category. And it won't matter if you're really upset, tell us that you got 3 other ones in another category. We'll be sympathetic, but that's not going to help this one fit in this category. So please make sure you pay attention to that. From our committee, from Brandon, Kevin, and Brittany, anything about categories that need to be reiterated before we move on to the first submitted question? Okay, we're going to go to the first submitted question. And I appreciate those of you that submitted. I think we got 8 or 10 questions here. And okay, one of my applications has a supporting record book tab that hasn't been there in the past. Is this a new tab? Is this something that we've got to do to compete this year? So I've done a little digging into that. That is a new tab this year. If you have not found that yet and you do find it or have a student bring that up, please do not panic. Hear what I'm about to tell you. That is not mandatory. There are states that use this system that are 100% AET states. We are not. We have some chapters that use AET, some that do not. I believe in the program. I think it's great. It's something that has to be paid for, and so we've left it to each chapter. Some states have said we make AET mandatory, therefore we want the records turned in with the application. So the application is set up now where states can choose to do that if they want. We do not. It's not mandatory on the national level. So if you end up having a state winner, don't panic that you're then going to have to go find a way to put that in AET. National FFA is not making that mandatory, neither are we. If you work through this application and for some reason you get notification that your application, your student's application is not final or not met, and the only reason why is because of that, you need to let me know right away. National FFA feels like they've got that taken care of. They feel like that will not be an issue. But if your student comes across and you think, hey, I'm all finished, but it's telling me not met or error because I didn't attach record books, let me know and we'll get that taken care of. That should not be a hindrance for your students. That is only an opportunity for chapters or states that want to do that. Okay. Next question that was submitted that I'm going to take, and then we'll go to some different folks here. Where does the proficiency application pull the description and number of animals from AET? So if you're an AET user, you know that your students put in their records in the AET and then it pulls over into the application. So the portion of your AET where the student names their SAE for each year and gives the description. Let's say they raise beef heifers and the category description or title is 2019 beef heifers or 2019 Angus heifers or Hereford bulls or whatever the case may be. Put my description, and that's where I would put my number. I have 4 head, 2 head of this, 3 head of that. That's where those get moved over. So making sure that the title and name that is given and the quantity or the herd size is accurate there. That's where that's going to be moved over. I hope that answers that question. If not, there can be some follow-up in the end. Okay, I think Brandon Ray is going to take this next question. In a placement proficiency, where it comes time to explaining the format of the SAE page, what's the best way to show growth in that page? Because that area, if you look at the rubric, part of the scoring is that you showed growth in that placement SAE. So Mr. Ray, will you field that one?
Yeah, good question. Definitely important because this is worth a large majority of the points in a proficiency category, and showing growth is one of your main goals when you're filling these out. So as you'll note on that page that I assume they're talking about, there will be year ranges where you can put in size, scope, and responsibilities. And the best thing in order to show growth is to make sure that you show added responsibilities that the student may have gained each year. So for example, maybe in the first year of their beef cattle proficiency, they're feeding and watering the animals, and then the next year maybe they're doing that same thing but also giving vaccinations, and then maybe the third year they're making some kind of breeding or genetic decisions as related to their projects. So you can see the growth there in the roles and responsibilities that the student has gained. And again, that's pretty important. I would caution you against copying and pasting on those roles and responsibilities the same thing for each year, and maybe just adding some hours, or the kid adding hours, because when these proficiencies are judged, there's not a lot of descriptives in that we can pull out of the application in order to see growth. So that will be that question. Mr. Lastly, did you have anything to add?
I think that's right on. Just make sure that you show growth in hours and responsibilities. And I think the point about not just copying and pasting is important. Human beings are reading these. Don't allow them something that's going to be easy to say, well, I don't know if I believe that, or boy, that looks pretty generic. Allow them to see the growth and understand it, and not wonder if it's true, or not wonder why the student didn't do more. Okay, next question submitted. For a placement proficiency, is an employer statement the best thing to use for the supplemental information page, or would you recommend something different? And Brandon, I think you were going to take this one as well.
Yeah, another good question, because this comes up a good bit, not just from one person each year, but what I would recommend, and I hear Mr. Benson talk about this a lot in the marketing CDE, but in this case, think about added value. What's going to add value to the proficiency application? So whichever one can best describe the SAE is the one that you need to use. And some of the things within that I would, kind of caution you to stay away from are really, like, if you're using an instructor statement, I would stay away from how great this kid was in a career development event, how many they've won, what a great officer they are. While I know that Johnny's probably a great FFA member and there's a lot of value in being an area or state officer, this is a proficiency application. So I would concern myself with the parts of the SAE and in explaining those in detail, especially if you're doing an instructor statement. And the same thing really goes for the employer statement. The employer sometimes may only give a paragraph of information, and maybe there's only one thing talking about how hardworking the student is. And we really want to see as much description there that can add value to that application as possible. So things like that are in the body of the letter, or need to be, maybe how far they've come, again, showing that growth in roles or responsibilities, showing new skills they've added as the project went along, and their just overall dedication to the SAE. I would also recommend these to be on letterhead. Make sure they're well drafted, signed, and have good grammar on them as well. And then the same thing with an employer statement, but don't just be very cautious. I know some of you submit a lot of proficiencies each year. Be very cautious in just copying and pasting an instructor statement and maybe changing a name here or there, because maybe the people judging get a multiple of your instructor statements, or they see them year after year, and then it just kind of gets monotonous, and it kind of think, if that teacher can't handcraft a personal letter about that particular student, have they really been supervising that project, or is it that great of a project like it's written up the rest of the way? So those are some of the things that I would kind of talk about when comparing instructors and employer statements and which ones to use.
I think those are good points. Thank you, Brandon. Something that I learned over the Christmas break that I want to make sure you're aware of, that is new this year. If you get into your applications, you may have already seen it. If you have not found it yet, you may run across it or have a student ask you about it. Beginning this year, there is an opportunity, and I say it that way, as an opportunity for multiple pages of supplemental information. And I'll explain it to you the way it was explained to me. That is not mandatory. It's not necessarily even encouraged, so to speak. You can get full points with 1 page supplemental. Why was this added? Again, I told you there are states that are asking for records to be included. And there are some folks that want National FFA to make that mandatory. National FFA says we're not going to do that because everybody doesn't use the same record keeping system. So one compromise that was made was allowing students an opportunity to submit more than 1 page of supplemental should they choose to. But here's again the way it was explained to me. Here's what the National SAE Committee was very clear about. You can overdo it and wear the judges out to the point that it's counterproductive in helping them see the SAE. 1 page is still fine. But if you find yourself in a bind and think, boy, it'd be great to include both of these, this year you can do that. It is 1 document. So if you have 2 letters or a picture in a letter or some type of other piece of evidence of a supplemental in a letter, if you can scan them into 1 PDF and upload 1 document that has 2 pages, you're allowed. But make sure in here, that doesn't mean you have to go have 5 or 6 or 7 pages just because they're allowed. You can overdo it. And if a judge looks at that and thinks, I don't know why all this is here, you're not helping your student's cause by doing that. So make sure that you're helping the student's cause with 1 more page. Look at it this way. If I've given you 23 pages to tell me why you should win the Forestry Proficiency Award, I'm giving you 1 more free page to tell me why you should win forestry. So it needs to stick to that. Why should you win that Proficiency Award? If you think through with the student, boy, there's 1 thing that we ran out of space. We didn't even get to talk about how you do this. Well, then find a picture of it, put it in your advisor letter and explain it. Use that supplemental page as an intentional piece. It'll help the student a whole lot more. Next question.
Mr. Lastly, can I mention 1 thing on that also?
Please.
On the supplemental pages, we often see picture collages, and those are great. They really do a good job of giving a visual of the words that you have in your proficiency, especially if it's pictures that you weren't able to use in the other photo part. I would encourage you all to put captions with those pictures. They don't have to be huge, but putting a small caption with that picture gives it more validity. It helps it have more oomph. I would also encourage you to go ahead and tell your teenage boys right up at the very beginning that a picture of their truck, even if they were able to purchase that truck with the money that they made from their proficiency, is not really relatable to their proficiency. So it's not an opportunity for them to brag about their wheels. But using those picture collages are another really good way. I like using Paint or Microsoft PowerPoint to put those together because you're able to put those text boxes over pictures a little bit better.
Thank you, Brittany. Those are great pieces of advice. Something common we see is, here's a picture of my jacked up truck. Here's a picture of me and my prom date. Here's a picture of me and my basketball team. Those are great things for students to be involved in. They don't tell me why you ought to win the equine proficiency. Something we've run into on the national level the last 2 years that I just would not have thought much about. I don't think we deal with it a lot here, but I want to caution you. Make sure you have rights, that the student has rights to the photo before you use it. Okay? What I'm talking about, if they're at some type of event and they can see online a proof of a photo before they go choose to buy it, having a watermark on there from whoever took the photo is one thing. If it clearly shows on there that it's a proof and the student does not have rights to the photo, that's going to end up being a problem. So be it in a collage or one of your 6 photos, keep in mind that the student needs to have the right to use that photo before they use it. Okay, next question submitted. In a placement proficiency, student works for their parents on the family farm. They do not pay them wages. However, the student does not have to pay for little things like their cell phone, extracurriculars at school. Does this need to be listed as partially paid since they do that for the student, since the parents provide that? The work on the farm is exclusively for them to pay for these things. The student's expected to work on the farm as needed. That's a good question, and it's going to lead into another question separate, that's going to be a separate answer. So because that is the student's primary place of living and those are daily, what might be considered normal family chores, that does not have to be included. If mom and dad are not paying the student, it's an experience-based SAE, that's okay. They don't have to account for the fact that they take care of your cell phone and maybe your auto insurance. This is going to bleed over into the next question. Where that gets different is if what they're providing is SAE related. Okay. What I mean by that is I mow the grass around my house. That's my landscape SAE. That's the landscape portion of my SAE. I mow the grass around the house. I don't get paid for that. I don't get paid for it because mom and dad pay the feed bill for my show animal. I don't pay anything for that. Those are SAE related. That's a barter, and we'll get into that in just a little bit. But what might be considered normal things, mom and dad buy my school clothes, they bought me a computer, they pay for my cell phone and auto insurance, but they don't pay me for the work I do at the house in our garden. That's you don't have to do a barter. That could be a straight placement. Okay. Leads right into the next question. In an entrepreneurship application, there's two parts to this. What items should equal in revenue and expense portion on the income expense page, and then where do you account for the loaning of equipment in your SAE? An example, the student barters labor for use of family livestock trailer, land, etc. I want to answer the second part of that first. So a student is using equipment or land that they're not paying for. Let's cover that one. It's an ownership SAE, it's entrepreneurship, and I report that I have my own landscaping business. But in my inventory, I don't list that I purchased any or own any lawnmowers. Well, that could really raise a red flag. How do you have a landscaping business if you don't have your own lawnmowers? So, or if you own 100 head of cattle, but you don't own any land, nor are you paying rent on land. Neither of those are insurmountable. You've got to report them correctly. So a barter on the expense page, on the financial page of an entrepreneurship application, the grid where the student has all the finances, there are a couple of places to show that they've got to be balanced out. So a student has got to show that they had a transfer or barter item, and let's say it was worth $1,200. Okay, let's say that I don't have any land value because I don't own land, but my cows have got to live somewhere. Or I grow corn, but I don't own a tractor or anything to harvest that corn with. I use my grandfather's. The fact is, I got a deal. I work with my grandfather to help him with his cotton. He lets me use his tractor at no cost to harvest my corn. So in my grain production or corn related application, I'm going to put the value of that tractor. Should I rent it or buy it? Each year, I'm going to put the value of what that would be. And then I'm going to go to non-cash expense and put the exact same value so it balances out. I'm paying for that tractor. I'm paying for that land my cattle live on. I'm just not paying in cash. I'm mowing the grass for free. I'm working in the cotton field for free. I'm doing whatever else for free in order for them to provide this other portion of the SAE for me. So it shows up in the transfer barter agreement. And let's say in 2020, that value was $1,200, I would come down to a couple of lines lower and put it in non-cash expense and put $1,200 in the same year so they balance out. I show how I acquired it. I show financially that I'm responsible for it without buying it. And it's not as if it just magically appeared. Also really good in the essay portion and or in the advisor letter, should you choose to include an advisor letter, to explain that barter so that we don't just find it there and hope that it's done right. If in the early parts of the written piece of the application, you can explain, I have a barter system where I take ownership of a tractor 6 months out of the year at $200 a month, ends up being $1,200 a year. And then when I go over to the financial page, I show $200 a year in the barter and $200 in the non-cash expense. And it makes sense what I told them earlier in the story. I've made balance in the financial. So make sure that is where that takes place. If a student is swapping out ownership, it's not uncommon for somebody at a student's age, a teenager, to not own all of the equipment or material that they need. Not uncommon for them to have a barter setup. The first part of that question, what items should be equal in revenue and expense portion on the income expense summary? the simplest way to explain that, and it is more in-depth than this, but the simplest way to explain that is this. On the cover page of the application, the student lists some financials. Toward the bottom, they list money that they brought in that's outside of the SAE, any personal, gifts, graduation money, my grandma loves me money, and then personal expenses or educational expenses. At the top of that page, there's a beginning and ending inventory of what the student has in the bank. So if I look and say, okay, on day one, that student had $100 in the bank. On the last day, whatever that may be, December 30th of 2000 for this year, that student had $10,000 in the bank. So they grew by $9,900. That student did. I then go look at their expenses at the bottom of that page, and I see that they spent $3,000 in personal expenses and $2,000 on educational expenses. That's $5,000. Okay, so my bank account grew by $9,900, and I spent $5,000 in the other two. Then I'm going to get into the SAE portion, and I'm going to see that in the SAE portion, throughout that 4 or 5 years or whatever it may be, total the student made $3,000. Your application is not going to balance there. Why is it not going to balance? Because you told me what you had in the bank and what you have now. I see your growth in money. You grew by over $9,000. You spent another $5,000. So you had to have enough money coming in to spend $5,000 and still have $9,000 to the good, but you only made $3,000, or vice versa. You show that you spent next to nothing. My bank account was $100 and now it's $500. I grew by $400. I didn't spend anything in personal expenses, and I didn't spend anything in educational expenses. And then I go over and I show that I made $20,000 in 5 years in my SAE. You're going to get an unbalanced message there. Why? Where's the money that you made? It's not in the bank, and you didn't spend it on something. So in the simplest form, have your student understand that what they say they had at the beginning in the bank, what they have at the end in the bank is important. The gap has got to be accounted for, and if they spent money. Now, toward the bottom of that cover page in the personal expenses, they don't have to itemize every nickel of every candy bar, every t-shirt, every concert ticket, etc. They're not asked to itemize that. And we're not talking about things related to the SAE. The best way I can describe that, have the student do all of their SAE related work. And if you've accounted for everything they spent on the SAE, and you think, okay, I had this much in the bank, I made this much, there's this much unaccounted for. Where is it? Well, you probably spent it. Oh, no, Miss Bell, there's no way I spent $5,000 in 4 years. And then you start helping them go through, well, how much would you say you spend a month? Do you spend $200 a month? Well, maybe $75 a month. Okay, what's 75 times 12 times 3 years? Oh, wow, maybe I have spent $5,000 of my own money. It's not bad to show that the student spent personal money. It's not. Some of them, I think it makes them worry to do that. That's not bad as long as it looks reasonable. To the contrary, it could actually look a little bit odd if a student makes $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 and doesn't spend any money. Maybe they're really fortunate and have parents with lots of resources, and they genuinely don't spend anything out of their own pocket. But I'm going to tell you, it sure looks a little suspicious. If their bank account grows that much and they make that much, so to speak, and they don't spend a dime of their own money, that looks a little bit suspicious. So to make your application balance, know what's in the bank at the beginning and end, know what they made and spent in the SAE, and then the rest of that, if it's unaccounted for, goes in personal finance. Okay, that's the best way that I can answer that, at least on this format. I hope that helps. Next question. I think Mr. Jump is going to take this one. My students' information. Oh, this is a membership question. I'll take this one. My students' information for FFA membership is not being populated in the website. Okay, I'll answer it generically, and then the teacher that submitted this is on here. I can deal with you specifically because it may be a specific roster question, but I can tell you if a student is going to do an application, one, they need to have a MyFFA account tied to their FFA ID number. Two, they've got to be on the roster for this year. And so when I hear that, the first thing I think of is the student on the roster for this year. You may have made them a member the last 3 years. they don't come to you till the second semester, so you haven't made them a member yet in 2021. If that's the case, that's the problem. If you haven't made a student a member yet, they're not going to be able to have all their membership because they're not on for 2021. If they are on the roster, then we've got some other issues, and I'll work through that with that teacher. So if you see a membership issue, make sure your student's on the roster, submitted to us, and that we've moved them forward to National FFA. Make sure they have a MyFFA account. And then if you've got questions outside of that, we'll deal with them specifically. And so, Dr. Sakini, I think you asked that question maybe. And if you will stick around toward the end of this, I will be able to answer that question specifically or get that student's name from you. We don't have to share that for everybody. And maybe we can be helpful there. Okay, learning outcome or a skill. The next question, is it acceptable for a student to indicate that he or she has learned how to administer vaccination? Mr. Jump is going to handle that question.
All right, hello, everybody. Let's see. I don't know if starting a video is a good or bad thing, so maybe we may take a vote on that later, but hope everybody's off to a great start this year. And anyway, just for brevity, looking at this question, there's a lot of things there really to answer, several things in one. First of all, it says for a learning outcome or a skill. There's a little bit of a difference on the proficiency application page between learning outcomes and efficiency factors versus a skill. So I'll take the easy one first, which would be, can you use it as a skill? There's actually an animal science skill. It's Animal Science 0701, I believe, that talks about preventing parasites, preventing diseases, and ensuring animal welfare. So this would kind of come under that. So that's definitely a skill that can be listed. And then you probably will mention the specific medication that's given. All right, so there are some medications out there that have to be administered by a veterinarian, and for obvious reasons that would not be acceptable for a student to give. Also, whenever you're administering medications to any animal, it needs to be something that's labeled specifically for that animal. I know sometimes we hear rumors, out in the world. We don't do this, of course, but there are those that sometimes administer medications labeled for one animal, they give it to another animal, and that's sometimes a common practice. If you do that and it's against any kind of law, then obviously you don't want to put that in a proficiency application. Somebody would notice that, and it would potentially be grounds for disqualification. But now there's several particular examples where you could do that. Tractor Supply, I'll just pick on them. For example, they have some over-the-counter medications like LA-200. So oxytetracycline is a drug that's commonly given to cattle and swine. It's an injectable that's either intramuscular or subcutaneous. And so a student learning that skill, being able to administer that, being able to recognize symptoms in their livestock, absolutely, that can be listed and should be listed on a proficiency application if that student actually does that. In a similar capacity, small animal, if somebody is actually raising dogs, Tractor Supply has a 6-in-1 shot that includes some of the kennel cough vaccines, parvovirus, things of that nature. You can purchase the injectable syringe that's already dosed and loaded for a specific size animal, specific age animal. That can save somebody some money making those kind of purchases and doing those online. I think that's like a $13, $14, $15 shot individually per animal, whereas if you go to a vet, it could be a little bit more. So students could save money doing that. But again, these are over-the-counter medications that can be purchased. So the administration of the medication would need to be something that would be lawful or legal for a student or the parent to administer. But learning how to do that, absolutely, I would encourage putting that on there. Now, the other potential here would be listing this as an outcome or efficiency factor. When you look at the proficiency application with each of these, there's a beginning level and a level obtained. So you want to show an improvement, maybe an increase in skill. Maybe there's several potentially different ways to write this up as an efficiency factor or a learning outcome. You could write it up in such a way that you learned how to make the administration yourself. You could write it up in such a way that it's saving you money because rather than having a vet involved for something that would be over the counter, you're making those, you're assessing symptoms and making a diagnosis and administering and over-the-counter medicine with some level of success that would save you money and also take care of those problems. So long story short, for this question, yes, it is acceptable for a student to show in each of these two areas potentially that they learned how to administer medication appropriately. They could actually even mention where they learned that from. It could be a skill that was taught them by their teacher, or it could come from a veterinarian. So a lot of potential there with this question to put in multiple different ways. But I think that's pretty quick, Mr. Lashley. Less than 5 minutes.
Thank you, sir. Okay, we got our first question in the chat I want to get to from Mr. Carr in just a moment. Wrapping up this first prepared portion, a couple of things I want to make sure you're clear about, because I've gotten some questions about them in emails. A student they completed an application last year and turned it in. They were not the state winner. They want to reapply in the same category this year. Certainly they can do that. We hope that they will. How do I do that? Do you start all over? Nope. The application is saved in that student's portal in your application manager as long as they're on your roster for this year. Go back to it. You will need to go to that main cover page and change the ending year. Last year, the ending date was 19. It's now going to be 20. You'll need to put in another year's worth of records. The question we're getting a lot of is, to turn it in last year electronically, I did all the electronic signatures. Should I withdraw those and have those people do them again? The answer is yes. I'm not just looking to give you more work, but here's why the answer is yes. Those things are time stamped when you print that application off and turn it in. And if all your signatures show that they were from January, February of 20 or December of 19, rather than January, February of 21, we're going to know that those people did not necessarily look at and approve this application. They approved one last year. Now, you don't have to track the principal down or the parents down or whomever and have them actually sign anything. It's all electronic now. There's steps in there to do that as long as they have an email address. But if you're going to use an application from the year before, you can and should do that. Withdraw or revoke those signatures, do them again so they have a current timestamp. We've not taught plagiarism. I hope to do that at the very end, but making sure that that a student does not plagiarize and take exact work from other students, even if they've done similar SAEs, worked at the same place, are related to or best friends with the other student, and they know I have their application and they don't care. That is checked. Please do not do that. Make it about that student's work. Do not copy and paste written descriptions, stories in the essays, photo captions. If you copy and paste, good chance it's going to get caught. And then that's going to be a bad conversation. So make sure that student knows that and avoids the plagiarism piece. A student cannot plagiarize themselves. If I turned in a forage production proficiency last year, and this year I'm going to apply in grain, or I want to apply with my cattle, and I have a similar caption or description, is that okay for me? It is. It's my work. It was my work last year. It's my work this year. Can't plagiarize yourself. You can plagiarize somebody else, including big sister, big brother, a cousin, no other individual's work that you take word for word. Okay, I think we're done with that. So the question in the chat that came up first, one of the first questions I can think of as a new teacher, unfamiliar with this process, is what type of SAEs are good to submit for proficiency applications? What are things that are looked for? That's a great question. Almost any SAE, Levi, is eligible to be turned in. And when I say almost, the opening comments I made, I'll reiterate now. The A is agriculture in SAE. Keep the A in SAE. If you will do that and pay attention to the guidelines, you're likely going to find a place for almost any SAE. If you decide, you know what, I'm going to count walking my dog or working at McDonald's, because in that student situation, that's the best they have, I'm going to let it count for an SAE in class. If you turn in a proficiency with those, one, I don't know where you're going to make it fit, and two, it's not going to do very well if you try to find a way to do that. So almost any SAE, as unique, as creative as it can be, it needs to be related to agriculture and really go through these categories and find the best place to put your student. And if you've got a specific question, You can shoot it in here or call or email, and we'll try to work it out. But we've seen students from the state level to the national level with some really creative ideas of SAEs, just to make sure that it's tied to agriculture. Okay, I haven't seen another question come through in the chat box. Ms. Schwing was looking at that for me as well. Brittany, did you see anything else come in that maybe I missed?
No, Levi's the only one so far.
Okay, I don't want to waste your time and extend this just to extend it. It's 4:52. We've been on here for about 50 minutes. I'm happy to talk as long as you guys have questions and we can be helpful. So I want to pause and see if there are any other questions that want to be entered in the chat, or anything that we started explaining that maybe didn't get explained enough or raised another question for you. If anybody would like to speak up or put something in the chat, now's the time.
So Levi asked, what do you think about a student running all platforms of social media for the FFA chapter? That's
a great question. That can work. You know, that ag communications area is wide open for things like that. And I'm glad you asked, because it leads to another common roadblock I want to mention. Yes, that can work. But I want to make real clear for everybody, doing CDEs and chapter officer responsibilities is not an SAE. So if a student, if that is their SAE, they form a newsletter and they do social media, that can be their thing, and that's okay. Because they're your chapter reporter, if they build the whole application around, I'm the chapter reporter, I do these things. If that's a normal task of a reporter, that's your job as a chapter officer. That's not an SAE. Now, they can be exclusive. I could have started as a reporter and thought I had to do an online newsletter the year I was reporter, and figured out that I really liked it and I had some skill level there. Now I manage the entire social media for our chapter. I do all these things. Don't tie it to their duty as chapter reporter. Same with any officer position. When they start listing SAE descriptions and tasks that they have, if it's tied to them being a chapter officer or them practicing for a CDE, that's not an SAE. An exception for that, if I'm in the agricultural education category and I'm helping Mr. Carr, I did environmental natural resources as a student, and we're already done with that. I can't do it again, but he's going to have a junior team. And as a senior, I'm going to help coach that team and develop some curriculum and learning materials for the freshmen who are doing junior ENR. That can count toward ag education for me, because I'm helping develop material in other people. Me putting in the hours that I practiced for forestry, ENR, livestock judging, that's not an SAE. Those are activities that I'm involved in as an FFA member, not hours toward my SAE. So Levi, I hope that answers your question. Yes, social media will work. Make sure that it's about that student's project, not about them being the chapter reporter.
Okay. Casey asked, if I have a student with a sheep production project, but they pay for some of their feed through their part-time job, which is unrelated to the SAE, how do we show that in the application?
That's a good question. On that cover page, Casey, on the cover page, there's a place to list non-SAE related income. You know, maybe a student works at a clothing store or a food store of some kind, and that's really where they make the money to put into their show project, because we know they're probably not going to make much money showing animals. You do that for a different reason. You would show that money in non-SAE income on that cover page, and maybe even talk about it in the story portion. Maybe explain, hey, this hobby of mine or this passion of mine of showing animals where I don't really profit much money, another job I have helps me fund that. And then I'll see that in the financial portion on that cover page where it talks about non-SAE income. I hope that helps, Casey.
Levi asked, hold on just a second, let me. Okay, so a project where it's an agri-science SAE. So I'm assuming, Levi, you're talking about like a research project that relates to injecting seeds with a chemical for germination. So are you asking, Levi, if that's a good project?
Yeah, just like how they could move that into being a proficiency, maybe.
Yeah, the research proficiencies are a little bit unique. They're a proficiency application. They're a little bit unique. And so if it's a research related project, the student's they're gonna go through the scientific process. They're gonna have, help me with the names of the papers. I'm drawing a complete blank. Their abstract, their procedures, their results, that kind of thing. So if a student is going through the process of conducting research, whether that's guided through someone else or work that they're doing on their own, yes, they can certainly do that. It needs to be related to agriculture, which it sounds like it is, and they need to document each step of the scientific process. Brittany, Brandon, Kevin, any addition to that?
Levi, are they doing that for a company? Are they working with someone else who's teaching them how to do that? Like as an intern or,
So, I mean, I'll just be flat out honest. This student does this stuff for fun on his own time. His dad is works at the college, and does different science experiments as well. I don't know how that really looks to be on paper. Actually, we haven't even ended our semester yet, so all my students haven't sent in all of their SAE information, but he's asked me a ton of questions in class that I don't know how to answer, to be honest with you. This is helping me form that.
So go ahead, Brittany.
Mr. Lastly's probably fixing to say the same thing, but Levi, what I would recommend is having that student do an agri-science fair project. And then I don't know what grade they're in, but then that gives them good experience, and the pieces are similar from an agri-science fair project to preparing that research proficiency. And it'll help both of you be able to complete the application. It sounds like he also has some support that can help him do that. I would encourage you to reach out to your science teacher.
Yeah, Ms. Swing, he's won our science fair like several years in a row.
Your science fair at school or the agri-science fair?
Oh, at school, sorry.
Okay. Yeah, our state agri-science fair might be a really neat opportunity with that project. And I would share this, depending on where that research goes, at that age is not necessarily mandatory. What we're trying to have the students learn at that age with that process is, do you identify a potential problem or a question? Do you say, hey, I wonder what would happen if, and then they walk through finding the answer? That's the point. That's the point of the research proficiency. So that's okay. It doesn't have to be that they're going to do something that UGA is then going to grab and go make $1 million with. It's cool if that works out, but it could genuinely start with, my dad's a researcher, my mom's a researcher. I've always wondered about this. So I looked into it, followed this process, and here's what I found. Anything else that's come up in the chat as far as questions?
Mr. Lastly, back on that one that we were just talking about with Levi, that in the description, on these proficiencies, it does say with agri-science research, they may be doing their own research individually, or they may be cooperating on projects with others, not limited to, schools and those kinds of things. So I guess, Levi, and I'm not the proficiency expert that some of these others are, but I guess it would depend upon the scope of what they're doing, because it would be like in beef production. If you had one beef cow, well, that's a proficiency and you're working on that, but it's really not going to stand up to someone that has a lot. And I'm not trying to discourage you from doing that. I'm just saying, I think it kind of depends on what they're doing and how big the scope is that they're working with, if that makes sense. And I apologize, Mr. Lastly, if I overstepped my boundaries there.
Not at all. Not at all. That's a great point. Are there other questions? Okay, well, let's do it this way. Parting shot from me. Thank you for being here. Go back and look at the material that was sent out on Monday. There are some really good help videos, broken down category by category and page by page of the application. There's a tip sheet. There's a making sure you're in the right category sheet. Really spend some time with those, and not just you, but your students as well. So I will be around. I'll stick around on here if maybe you want to ask something and for whatever reason don't want the whole world to know about it. I'm happy to stick around, but at this point, unless there are more, we will end this officially. I appreciate you being on. Good luck to you. And in the next 2 weeks, as you finish these, if you have questions, you're not bothering us, please call and ask. We want to help you. We want you to help your students, and we want a good experience for everybody. God bless y'all. I'm going to end this recording. And if there's anything else, please